Okay, I hope everybody can hear me okay tonight. I know I'm a little bit in an echoey room, but let me know if there's any problem hearing or understanding what I'm saying from where I am. But thanks everybody for joining tonight, and we'll call the meeting to order. Our first item is to look at the minutes for the April meeting. Does anybody have any comments or any suggestions or changes on those minutes? Not hearing any. I'll ask for a motion then to approve those minutes. A second. Okay, all in favor? Aye. Okay, good. And I believe we may have a couple of comments tonight from the public. Joanna, if you would like to take over and handle that, we'll cover that next.
I'd be happy to. So good evening. My name is Joanna Bloom and I'm serving as the technical host for this meeting. We'll start by sharing a few slides of the virtual meeting rules that we follow. These rules are in place to find a balance between transparency with community members and security that minimizes disruptions. We do need a full name associated with each person's participation in open or public comment, and we cannot unmute you without it. If your full name is not currently displayed, go ahead and change it, or you can always send me a text and I'm happy to change it for you. And I'll give my number here in just a moment. There's no chat feature for this meeting, but if you do run into Zoom connectivity issues, you're welcome to use the Q&A function, or you can again text me at 303-817-1742. Members of the public may be unable to control the audio or video features. Video is limited to city officials, employees, and invited speakers only. And I'll unmute you when you are recognized to speak and call your name. And then you'll see a 3-minute timer display once you begin your comments. Thanks so much for your participation. All right, so if you are wanting to speak during open comment this evening, if you can find the raise hand function on your screen, typically that's on the bottom, and you can virtually raise your hand. I'll go ahead and call you in the order that it was received. I do see Lynn Siegel, followed by Eric Gertler. Lynn, I will go ahead and ask.
Hold up the inclusiveness of plurality.
Just a second, I'm trying to get rid of Chris Hedges on Iran.
Become a target because
Where is that?
liberals themselves have become so
I'm sorry.
bankrupt.
Can you go with the next person?
I sure can, Lynn, and then we'll come back to you. All right. Next, we have Eric Gertler. Hi, Eric, you should be able to unmute. Can you hear us okay?
Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know how to turn my video on. I'm looking for a command. I don't see one. Anyway, I'll get started. I sent an email to the advisory board and to Joe earlier today. I understand it was not 24 hours in advance. I'm wondering if anyone received that and might have some idea about what I want to talk about today.
We did receive that note, Eric, and I think several of us on the board are aware of that particular issue. So if you'd like to make some comments, go ahead, and then I think our director will be able to respond and maybe give you a little bit of the context about what's going on.
Okay, well, I live at 237 Pearl Street. I've lived in Boulder for 30 years, and the Farmer's Ditch is basically my backyard. In April, with a little warning, I was told there would be maintenance on my backyard. And they came in and basically dug up a large portion of the ditch and piled, made a huge mess. And my next door neighbor got a bigger mess. And when discussions with them, I learned that what was going on was this is the beginning of a 30-year, $3.5 million project to double the capacity of the farmer's ditch. There was no notice. We were given no preparation. I don't know why this is happening. And I'm very disappointed. It feels to me like no one at the city of Boulder is looking out for the residents of Boulder. This is a big project that will affect many people, disrupt traffic, potentially rebuilding streets. I don't know. I'm not an engineer. I've never gone to the city to work an issue like this. I'm just starting on this project. I've been traveling and now I'm trying to dig in. So your guidance and your patience with me would be greatly appreciated. But I do want to dig in. I want to understand why this is happening. I want to be sure that someone is looking out for the interests of us citizens. And I got to tell you, having my backyard messed up like this in preparation for a stream flow that's, I think, planned for 2050 does not feel to me like anyone is trying to make this go well.
Okay, thank you for those comments. And at the end of our public comment session here, Eric, our Director of Utilities, Joe Tadeucci, will, I think, be able to respond to your questions and comments. Do you want to do that now, Joe, or would you like to wait until we're done with the other comment?
We can wait. And good evening, everyone. I'm Joe Tadeucci. I'm the Director of the Utilities Department. Let's see if Lynn's able to do her comments now. If she's still having trouble, I can speak to it now.
Sounds good. Lynn Siegel is next. Lynn, I'm gonna go ahead and ask you to unmute and see if you're ready to
Yeah,
provide comment.
thanks for hanging in with me, Joanne. It was on my panel across the top with a little signs on it, and I had to get off there rather than the Zoom. I kept hitting the Zoom thing. Anyway, yeah, I've heard Eric complain about this, and that doesn't sound very good to me either. I'd like to hear a back and forth with him and Tadeucci, and hear what's going on here. I think there needs to be a lot more dialogue with the city of Boulder boards and the public, which there's just not. It just feels like an echo chamber. I know Joe's going to address Eric's thing, but I've been talking to you about overuse of water for years and years and years, and no one ever responds back. You know, there's the National Geographic little city there. You know, there's it was what's the name of it? Weather Vane, you know, these I follow mostly planning board, tab, landmarks board, and all I see is every which way there's subsidies given. There's $5 million giveaways at, you know, Juniper, 1015 Juniper. For you demolish the place, they'll build a $10 million home there just because it's on the confluence zone. Well, sorry, the people bought the land on the confluence zone. Why is the city of Boulder essentially paying them off to demo their place because they can't move their house into the make it larger, you know, into the confluence zone? Well, you know, why? Why should the city of Boulder give them a subsidy? So that we have another affordable housing crisis to make up for this, for another $10 million house? You know, this is just outrageous that then we have more and more people, more and more density, more and more people drinking water, more and more people showering. You know, my friend is probably the only person in all of Boulder that has a half bath. Seriously, that's all her house has is a half bath. And I hope she gets a huge tax benefit from that. She doesn't even have a shower. She's got a toilet in her bedroom. It's as if she's homeless with a house. You know, is this what the city wants for folks? You know, the more density, the more, you know, these bedrooms. There's 5 bedrooms, there's 6 bedrooms. What's next? 7 bedrooms to an apartment in Boulder for the density? That's a lot of water use, right? You know, the CU South, horrendous, outrageous, should never have been. No, Joe, no, Joe, simple. How about Sundance Event Center, 2,500 people. That's a lot of water. We don't have it. I don't even see where my, 6 seconds.
Yeah, you're out of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lynn, for your comments. Thank you, Eric. And I think Joe can respond to some of Eric's questions for a few minutes.
Yeah, thank you both Eric and Lynn for the comments tonight. I'm aware of the maintenance work on Farmer's Ditch, and Eric, I appreciate that when that happens, it can feel really impactful to property owners. The city does have a role with irrigation ditches in various ways. They're actually separate companies, separate entities from the city, which is not to suggest we don't have a connection to them. But the way they function, they really have to operate in the interests of their shareholders. Now, the Farmer's Ditch in particular, the City of Boulder Utilities is a majority shareholder, and we have three staff members who hold board positions, including Emily McMurtry, who is in our Utilities Water Resources Department, and she is the current president of the board. I think in Eric's email, he had mentioned Joanna Bloom was the president, which she was at one time. But has since moved off the board, and we have other staff in there. And so in some cases, we have a direct interest with an irrigation ditch like that. We're on the board. We coordinate with the other board members and the maintenance staff for the work that is gonna happen. In other instances, we play sort of a liaison role to the community and other departments in the city because we have the experience with ditches. It is a tricky balance to strike in a modern city like Boulder to have these irrigation ditches that have really powerful easement rights that go back to the formation of the city, and they need to do their maintenance work, and it sometimes can impact in negative ways private properties and trees and sediment and removal, like was done in the description that Eric provided. So one thing I can do is, I think in 2019, we prepared a memo for the board explaining irrigation ditches in detail and how they work and what our interest is, how the maintenance works like that. I can also share that in response to Eric's email. I didn't have a chance to do that today, but I think that would shed a lot of light on how they work. I do know in terms of the work that is being done on any of the ditches over time, they fill up with sediment. Trees and vegetation grows next to them because there's such a rich source of water there, and the roots can fill in the ditch, and every so often ditch companies need to come through and remove that sediment and sometimes remove trees, and for sure that's impactful to private properties. And in the role that we play in utilities, we've tried to influence the ditch company maintenance work to respect the rights that they have to do the work, but also ask that they do it in a neighborly way. So in general, that's kind of a quick response in the moment to the situation, and we can follow up directly with Eric in the next day or two to have a discussion with him directly. But I do understand the impacts, and some of that has to be that way, but we certainly want the notice to be there and encourage the ditch companies to do that in advance of the work. One last thing that I just thought of, in terms of the capacity of the ditch, it's attributable to water rights in the state, and so there's a designated amount of water and flow capacity that the state has associated with the Farmer's Ditch water rights, which I believe are about 55 cubic feet per second. And over time, as the ditch fills up with sediment and is encroached on by trees and roots and things, they lose the capacity, so. It's not really, in my mind, it's not really a project to expand the capacity to be something bigger than it's been, it's really restoring the capacity that's been there. That's important to our city utilities because we have water rights in that ditch that in a dry year in particular, we can have that water go to the Boulder Reservoir and be treated, so it's an important source to the city. So I hope that helps in the moment and we can follow up more in the coming days.
I did just want to flag, Mr. Chairman, that there are a number of attendees and I did see another hand come up. So I just wanted to check real quick with some of the attendees if anybody wanted to participate in open comment, if that's all right. So for those of you that are online, if you would like to virtually raise your hand to indicate that you would like to speak in open comment, now's the time. Otherwise, I can pass it back over. All right. I think we allow one comment per meeting, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
But we will follow up here shortly. Anyone else wanting to speak? All right, thanks so much for the extra time. Just wanted to make sure we got everybody. I'll pass it back to you, Mr.
Okay. Thank you, Joanna. And thank you, Eric and Lynn, for your comments. And we'll try to respond to those in timely manner. Okay, I think we're on to the main topic on the agenda tonight, our main information item and a discussion from the staff about the capital improvement plan, 5-year capital improvement plan. And so I'll turn it back over to you, Joe, to introduce who's going to kind of fill us in on the details tonight that we discussed a month ago.
Great, thank you for that. And so, as mentioned in the May meeting, the agenda for tonight, we really cleared the whole agenda for just one topic, which is what we normally do in June of every year. And that is to look at our capital improvement program. Each year, the city goes through the budget process, and it's really, we're in year 2025 now. It's the next year that gets approved by council in the budget process. But because utilities has such a big program in capital improvements, we look at a 6-year CIP, we call it. And that's all context for the board and what the recommendation that we'll be asking for in July. So I will say we have 2 new board members this year, and the capital improvement program and rates and a recommendation to city council in July is probably the most important thing that the board does each year. And so each year in June, like I said, we like to take a deep dive, dedicate the whole meeting. We have staff here to answer questions. We're really hoping to get your feedback and would love to hear it tonight or before the July meeting. You can certainly follow up individually with me after if you have questions later. And then our hope would be to bring back a revised CIP and rate proposal if necessary based on your feedback and hopefully responsive to it. And so that's the program for tonight. And presenting tonight, we have Chris Douglas, who manages our utilities engineering work group, senior manager there, oversees the team that does all of the capital projects. And then Steph Klingeman is our principal financial analyst. And so Chris will be talking about the systems that we have the capital projects in, highlighting some of the projects. It's not necessarily all of the 2026 ones that we'll be highlighting. It's really in the 6-year program, some of the prominent ones that we'll put a spotlight on. And I think the way we have it set up, just like May, we'll break the presentation up into sections and let the board ask questions as we go so that you don't have to retain it all for the whole time. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes.
Chris. You're starting.
Yes, good evening, board members. Again, I'm Chris Douglas, the Utilities Engineering Manager. Joe really set things up, so maybe I'll just dive into the next slide.
Hey, Chris, could I
Yes, sir.
interrupt for just a minute? In looking through all this material ahead of time, and particularly all the spreadsheets and so forth that you have in the back, one thing that occurred to me that might be helpful tonight would be if you could maybe emphasize or spend a little bit more time on the projects which have the greatest impact, in the next year or two, as opposed to the ones that are kind of stretching out farther into the future. Because I think, we're going to have a limited amount of time to get into the details of all of these different projects. So maybe if you could kind of focus on the ones that are coming at us closer in the future, that would be helpful.
Yeah, and absolutely, I'm glad you asked that, because we do have really on the setup here, so we'll have a couple of, talk about a couple of projects, and it's a blend of projects that are a little bit longer in the capital improvement program, but then also there is a spot to pause and showing where those major projects that were actually in the 2026 budget.
Great.
So we'll have that really for each of the utilities on this discussion point. So really, as we look at it here in this overview, is just a few slides to really kind of touch on what we talked about last month on the overview of the capital improvement programs. And then we'll talk about the key projects and changes. And at the end of each one of those utility discussions, we'll have that pause to talk about 2026 projects. And then Steph will talk about financial matters and we'll wrap up. Certainly feel free to, I have some pause sections worked into the presentation, but if anything comes up while I'm discussing, please feel free to chime in.
Okay, it sounds good. Thank you.
Sure. And so really this first section, and it's just really is 3 quick slides on kind of capital overview programs, touching on each of the on the utilities. And really, this is the kind of the foundational slide that we talked about here, where we have utilities infrastructure that's it's a very complex system and it's several $billion worth of assets. We are trying to reinvest in those in that critical and necessary assets. There is a backlog and a replacement needs are large. And then also as we go into here, which is what we're talking about a lot tonight, is funding strategy. So we are trying to avoid rate spikes while maintaining system reliability. And we look at risk and cost and are trying to balance those things within as individual projects, because there's projects I'll talk about a little bit later that we've pushed back in the capital improvement program, or would actually move some forward. So we do move things around a little bit, as Joe has talked about over the years, this concept of, if you think of a big music mixing board and you've got the sliders. So we're doing that constantly within the capital improvement program. And this slide is some information on the water system, and we use an asset inventory management system to help determine capital replacement priorities. So each of the assets or each of the pieces has a utility condition index score that is combined to create an overall utility index score for the entire utility. So, and what does a utility index score mean for the water utility? It's less about the UCI number, but more about the trend in the numbers. So having that score of 100 is really a brand new system, which really is a practical, just because the volume of assets that we have. But we also don't want a score that's a 0 either. So a lower score means? Lower score means it's getting closer to the end of its useful life. But does it mean that's the end of its useful life? No. And really, what we're really trying to do is kind of represented by this graph is you can see in the numbers that both in the treated water system and the source water system over the last couple of years, the UCI numbers are trending down. We expect that because when something gets old, it reaches more to its useful life. So we're trying to flatten the curve. Yeah. And really with that concept of flattening the curve is you look at projects like the 63rd water treatment plant that we talked about last month, or even the 63rd water line project that we toured last month. By doing that rehabilitation, we're bringing those individual UCI scores up, which then flattens that trend. So this is really an indicator of, if we weren't doing anything, the downward trend would be even worse. So that's really where we're trying to forestall that trend, and what can we do to, in the future, have that trend go back up. That's a difficult cost balance that we're really trying to look at.
Chris, can I?
Yes.
Ask for that quickly? So I like how you explained that and said another way. If it was a brand new city, everything, we had both treatment plants, brand new, all of our pipelines, the score would be 100. It's not possible with all the assets for that to be the case. So just like a car, they're depreciating all the time. And so we're trying to manage the collection of them and bringing the ones with the lowest score back up, and then the collecting comes up.
And quick question, like, because I think showing this chart, they're depreciating faster than we're replacing or putting money in. And is that because they're going to other systems that are not the treated and source water systems?
It's a combination
Okay.
of that, and it's also, if you look at the approximately $3 billion in assets that we've got, that is trying to balance versus rates, and we'll talk about recommended rate increases. We would be somewhere in that 15 to 20 million that we need to be putting into rehabilitating assets, whereas we've been trending at about $10 million a year. So we're looking at trying to increase that number, but also balancing that with reasonable rate increases. So we've been given a really good system by the previous folks that built everything, and now we're in that cycle of it's time to start replacing things. So this is a continual cycle that we're really dealing with. So we're trying to find that right balance, and it's investing our money wisely as we look at risk and getting those things where we feel we have a high risk to be.
Spending 10 million and you'd like to go up to 15 to 20?
That is one of those, as we're looking into something that's coming in future years, is looking at a longer term capital improvement program as to where we've got. So this is not something that is uncommon in the industry. And I would say even Boulder is being more realistic and aggressive than a lot of other cities for reinvesting into our system.
Right.
But we're still behind.
Chris, can you remind us as well, so when we talk about the rate increases, there are 3 different funds.
Correct.
And so only what goes into the water fund is what's gonna help with the treated water and source water.
Correct. So yeah, we have a water fund, which is source and treated water, a wastewater fund, and a storm and flood fund or utility. And they are all call them quasi-municipal independent companies, even though we're nested underneath the city. But the funds that come into each one of those entities is spent on those individuals. Yeah.
And is there a number that either causes you worry or causes you to sleep well at night, maybe on these UCIs?
That's a number that we've been having a lot of internal debate. What's the right number?
Yeah.
It's not 0 and it's not 100. But it's not in that realm of this is a letter grade aspect. So we would like to see it start to trend out and flatten, which is what we've got. But I have turned around and said, this is the number that we're shooting for. We're still trying. This is a relatively new grading system that we're still trying to work through what that best number is.
I noticed somewhere in the report, Chris, that there was a comment made that the city was worried that a lot of it, particularly on the drinking water side, that the infrastructure was aging rapidly and that we need to make, substantial investment in that area in particular. But yet it seems that the, rate increase in that part of the program is about the same as it has been over, the average of the last several years. Are you guys concerned that rate may need to be higher in the future, or that we're kind of not keeping up with ourselves there, or we're going to have to increase those percentage gains in the future so that we don't let that number, your UCI sort of number, get too low?
I might take that one, Steve, and I think one of the conversations that I'm having with Chris and the managers of each of the capital improvement programs for each of the utilities is really establishing a long-term plan where we get all of the assets that need attention on the table. We've done a version of that in the water fund.
It's storm flood.
Well, I'm thinking of the AIM program in water. But then we did an updated comprehensive plan a few years ago in storm and flood, and we really, in simple terms, got a collection of all the projects in our backlog. And we looked at how can we get these done in several decades of time, and what would the rate increases look like? I want to replicate that for wastewater and water. And so for the moment, between the staff resources we have, what we think is reasonable to manage the projects and maintain what we've got, Steve, I think the rate increases that we're proposing right now seem reasonable. But I'm hoping as we do that longer term look in the next few years, we'll be able to better answer that question. And as soon as the team finished the comprehensive flood and stormwater plan, that was my question to them. It's like, okay, we've got 35 projects listed here to build this out. Can we do this in a reasonable amount of time with reasonable rates or not? And when we looked at it, the answer was between some bonding here and there and spacing them out, we think we can. And so I think we just need to look at that a little more comprehensively and have those discussions with the board in the next few years.
And I'll thank you for that primer, Joe, because if you wait 2 slides, talk about that.
So is there a UCA for the floodwater system?
But floodwater is a little bit different. So we're looking at it a little bit different from the flood perspective, because the storm and flood utility we're still having to build infrastructure to meet our stormwater and flood goals. So it's a little bit, and it's also a little bit harder sometimes to track some of those things in the storm and flood utility, because it's just a little bit different than the way you look at it. And this slide is really trying to talk about the wastewater system. And we don't have right now this asset inventory and UCI scores in the wastewater system right now, but we're working on it. So that's really where we're looking in the next couple of years on pulling that together. But we're doing a lot of pre-work where we're improving our data quality for the sewer model and correlating asset information in our GIS system. And then also doing a deeper dive in those assets at our water resources recovery facility out at 75th and looking on that end. But one of the things that really comes in here is, even without the scores, this graphic really shows you what we're doing. This is the sanitary sewer lining program that we've been really from some direction from City Council in 2015. We're looking at a big relining program and completion by 2035. Big thing to show on this trend is, you look on the left figure is the original date that that infrastructure was installed. So you look again, in particularly in downtown Boulder, there's a lot of red following that red, yellow, green motif.
Red
is old. And so that follows that red light concept that we talked about last time. Whereas then you look at the slide on the right, and you can see how we've gone from so much red to a lot of green. That's what we have lined since 2015. So it really has brought the effective age of the pipe really up. And so we've got more detail as we dig into it, but it's, even though we don't have the official AIM and UCI scores, we're still doing a whole lot of work that is helping us to get there. And the UCI work will just help us define it a little bit better.
I don't want to keep taking us down rabbit holes, but in the history of RAB and rate discussions, when we were like the sewer backups that happened in the 2013 flood, when we were looking at that, and I was in a different role at the time, the team had a 100-year plan to realign the system. And I think a combination of council and board feedback with what people were experiencing with sewer backups in their homes. They said, what would it take to do that work in 20 years? And so we came back, it was either 2014 or 2015 with a 30% rate increase that was requested of us by council and the board. And we're doing that work and we're generally on track to turn all that stuff green in 20 years instead of 100. That's what it takes sometimes.
Then in the storm flood utility. Really this is that long-term plan that Joe had talked about from the 2022 comprehensive storm and flood plan. So the figure on the left identifies the 30 individual flood reaches that need to have flood improvements. And then the figure on the right is we've taken those 30 reaches and combined them into 14 projects, which you can kind of see lumped together. And the goal was to have the projects be approximately $15 million a piece. And we're doing one project every 3 years. So that's where Joe talked about that 30-year, how do we get there to complete all of the flood assets? That's what this plan is. And actually we're starting, because we've got some other projects in the current 6-year capital improvement plan, but the first project, that first grouping in 2 Mile Canyon Creek, we're going to be beginning design work in 2030. So it's a little bit further out in the out year, but we're setting ourselves up to start that process.
What standard is the flood management being built to?
What our goal is flood protection is at 100 years.
100. And is that historic or is that possible future?
And that's looking at, because in a lot of areas, we don't have that level. We're looking at that historic level. But we're also looking at each individual reach on a case-by-case basis, because some of those reaches, and one we'll talk a little bit later tonight in Gregory Canyon Creek, is in a highly populated area, very dense, can't get to that 100-year storm with the available room that we have to do the project. So there's the goal of the 100-year, but then we're also having to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And we've been asking lots of questions. This was my first formal pause for questions. So,
I think it's great to do this conversation.
I really
And answer
appreciate
your
it.
questions as they go.
I will move on, and now I'm going to talk about some of the key projects by each utility in the capital improvement plan. So we're going to start with the water utility. I'm sorry.
Amy has her hand.
Hi,
Oh,
I just had
Amy?
a couple of very general, I think, overarching questions. I wondered if there was a standard escalation for all capital construction costs that is assumed for the projects, an annual escalation. It looks like it's 4%, but I just wanted to acknowledge, I guess, that these costs we're not just assuming constant. And then secondly, contingency, how much contingency is assumed in some of these construction costs as we move into, I agree with Steve's focus on the next couple of years, but just thinking out into the future, if we've assumed greater amounts of contingency for the projects that we don't have as much detailed design and cost estimates on.
Yes. So certainly on the escalation, as we are assuming a 4% cost escalation on these projects, and that's something that in the last few years, particularly post-pandemic, and we've seen significantly higher increases on that end, but having that across all of the utilities, at least accounting for that cost increase. And then Amy, you brought up the question on contingency, and I don't know if you remember from last month, we had that final figure that, but depending on how much we know about a project in that level of a class 5 estimate, a lot of times we're in that plus 100%, minus 50% on a project when we're very early in the stage. So, and then as you get closer to knowing more about the project, that contingency funnel decreases. And so we are looking at, from a class 5 level, really anything that is probably greater than 3 years out in that capital improvement program. Because there's just so many things that you don't know about a project. And as it gets closer into the kind of final design and design work in, say, 1 year or next year out, we're in that potential class 1, class 2, just depending on where we are in the design process.
So you're assuming like 20% on the more immediate construction costs?
It's somewhere in that range, and I would say generally speaking, that's like based on what we know at the time. And I will admit, and it's also one of those things that, and we're still struggling because the construction market is changing. So we do work with staff when things, you know, things are coming in and we're having to adjust on funding vehicles, and that's a lot of times where staff and I and the project managers spend a lot of time and having a lot of, I wouldn't call them difficult conversations, but really pointed conversations to work through advancing projects.
We have to adapt on the fly.
We do. And there will be a couple examples of projects that have come up where we have adapted on the fly. See. So this one, this project here on the source water system is, we have a couple of source water pipelines. And so really following that red and green motif, this is the Barker Gravity Pipeline. And the green, the big bold green is pipes that we have lined since 2017. And then you can kind of see in the light red there are the sections that we need to complete. We've got about 14,000 feet of pipeline and siphons and to replace, and we're spending approximately $5 million a year. So this is one of those areas where you'll see funding in 2026, but then it's even going out to 2029 when we think we're completing the project. And the big thing about this particular project, with it being one of our water sources, is we're doing this construction in the winter where we don't need as much water from the source water side, and where we can line it and then get it back on for the summer demand season. And then the other series of projects in the source water system is, it's really based on some updates from the state engineer's office in 2020. They readjusted the way they look at dam safety related to the hydrologic hazard of a dam, the seismic design requirements, and the hydrologic modeling, where the water draining into the dam. And so we've shifted the prioritization over the last few years to be looking at that in our high hazard dams. And one of the projects that we completed in this is on Barker Dam, which is just outside the town of Nederland on Boulder Creek. And we did a dam stability project and looked at the hydrologic and seismic loading. And then the city went through an evaluation process with some dam safety experts. And now we're recommending looking at a more advanced monitoring program instead of actually going forward and doing what could be a significant capital improvement project. So that's the type of thing that we're looking at for related to dam safety.
And give enough leeway, advanced warning monitoring that you actually.
Correct. And so, and that's really, and certainly it's a partnership with ourselves and the state engineer's office on where we're and how we're looking at things. So now shift over to the treated water system and really start with the water treatment plants. And so we have an ongoing corrosion control disinfection project at the Patasso Water Treatment Plant. And one of the things that came out of that is we were looking at what our requirements are for the disinfection tank at the Patasso Water Treatment Plant. And there was one of the factors was significantly more expensive than we anticipated. So we're doing a reevaluation project on what our goals are on that. And we've shifted that to 2029 instead of what we were thinking would be earlier years in CIP. And then Also, one of the other project that we're looking at is our chemical disinfection systems at both the Picasso and Boulder Reservoir treatment plants. And we're looking in 2026, beginning design work where we're replacing aging tank and storage infrastructure to bolster that up as well. And then moving on to transmission piping, and so the board may remember in blue that we toured the 63rd Street pipeline last month. And that project is moving forward, and we're looking at completion in 2026. We're just about here this summer. The section north of J Road, we'll be opening that back up, and then we'll be working on the section there in blue south of J Road. And then also looking at a bidding next year of the Kohler Tank to Broadway pipeline there in the orange, with future years in the out years CIP in the pink. And so again, the Kohler to Broadway, I believe, is one of those ones where there will be some funding required in 2026. We'll be asking for recommendations from the board. Then in the outer years of the CIP, I'll just touch base on the our tank replacement program. We've got several tanks that are in the early 1900s era that need to be replaced. So we're looking at projects related to other things like at the treatment plants or some of the other pipeline projects, because these tank projects are going through long-term outages. So bolstering up or making those other areas of the system more reliable so that we can take these tanks offline, which could be for several summers. And then, Steve, this is the slide for you. Here's the slide of the major programs in the water CIP for 2026. These are projects that are over about $500,000 in funding that will be either it's a new project or we're infusing funding in 2026. And so it's a combination of individual projects and programs. And maybe now's the right time to pause and see if there are any questions.
If I can add to what you just said, the way it works out when we bring the CIP every year, it may be that what's designated in the next budget year, 2026 in this example, it could just be an investigation or a design or something like that. That's not a big dollar number. Or it could be something like the meter replacement that we're using capital funds, but they're not necessarily major projects. I think on that list, probably the Parker Kostler penstock repair has potential to become a big one soon. And then some of those dam stability projects, I think, are more in the studies realm, but have the potential to become big projects later.
Chris, could you go back 2 or 3 slides and where you talked about the Barker Dam stability project, and how did you refer to it? How that works? I don't think we've heard much about that. Can you give us 2 minutes of what that project actually sort of consists of?
Sure. As we look through with the state engineer and their changing requirements, and really some of the specifics on the Barker Dam is there are anchors in the dam itself that are basically giant rods that drill through the dam and into the rock foundation. So, and how that was installed in the 80s, it's difficult to understand what the condition of those anchors are. So we're looking at, but then they also put some test anchors just outside the dam so that you can go and pull those test anchors out and see what the condition of the metal is. That gives us an indication on what we're going to do. Also, one of the things that the experts recommended for us is some hydraulic monitoring within the dam, or some basically drilling some small holes in the dam to where we can understand the water level. So how does the fluctuation of water level impact the stability? Because we're in that thinking the dam is full, it's pushing against the dam. Well, is there water seeping through the dam or is there not? which then leads to stability. So this goes, you could go into the much bigger aspect of, we could have in that realm of an estimate, $100 million range of a job to really work on the stability on the dam. But really the experts are saying, no, let's take a pause, double check what you've got before you go out and do that big capital project. So that's the type of thing that we're getting. It's that recommendation on, okay, let's monitor the water going to the dam or around the dam. And does that lead us to having to do something versus just automatically going to doing a very large capital project? Does that help, Steve?
Yeah, okay, thanks.
And you said these are new, just part of some new science, was just in terms of monitoring.
It's part of this, the monitoring is there.
Yeah.
And that's not really the new science. Really, the new part is, like, for instance, the state engineer has looked at on the seismic stability. They're always changing how you calculate that. So they've said, oh, we know more data and we have more data now. Maybe the chance of having an earthquake is different.
Higher.
It is, I'm trying to remember I think it's a frequency, but not necessarily a magnitude. So they're saying, okay, let's take that new data. Well, how does the dam react to that? And really on that end and what's our factor of safety? And so it gets into that point of, your factor of safety is still safe and you still have that factor of safety, but it's maybe a little bit lower than current standards. So what can we do to get us up to current standards?
It's that many of our systems are subject to regulatory changes. More broadly, that's what we're talking about here. The regulatory standards have changed. And typically when that happens, you have a certain amount of time to come up to that standard if it's higher. So that some of our wastewater projects are at the wastewater plant are driven by different regulations, but there's a lot.
Yeah.
Is transportation coordination here just across?
Well, and what transportation coordination is, what we've realized, so, one of the things we've got is, where's the value of a project? And if transportation is repaving or installing a new bridge, does it make sense for us to come in and do a water line project in conjunction with that? So, for instance, one of the ones is right off of 55th is Central Avenue, and transportation is going to be replacing that bridge. Well, as we looked at it, they're going to do the water line in their bridge construction footprint. But it actually makes more sense for us to do the water line from there all the way out to 55th. So instead of having a concept of we want to do that project, we don't have funds allocated for it. We're kind of creating a program there to where we have that flexibility to work back and forth with other departments. So that's really that, you see that transportation one, and it's something we've done for a long time in the storm and flood utility, but haven't done it as much in other utilities. It's just the allowing us to, frankly, it makes it easier to get to a yes, instead of having to say, oh, well, we have to put on some other project.
Can you talk a little bit about the
Albion Dam is a reservoir we have that's up in the watershed. And it is, we're doing a major upgrade to that dam based on some safety concerns that were brought up by the state engineer. So that's really, it's a project that's been going on for a while, and it was to infuse a little more funds to get that project to completion.
And then for the Barker gravity pipeline is second, so that should finish in 2026.
So you'll see that's where we're thinking that project's going to be finished in 2029. And that's the one from the figure where we're spending about $5 million a year. So we've broken that out into winter time sites.
I'm just curious in terms of risk, anything of failure, any consequence for any of these.
Well, I mean, I'll just say go on, stay on the Barker gravity pipeline that was installed in 1909. So it's pretty amazing that it's been around and we've come up with a really ingenious process to be able to do this in small chunks. So you'll look at all of these on that risk and stability. I talked within staff within utilities engineering as we go into UCI numbers and those sorts of things. Those are helping us to make decisions on what we kind of call second page projects. They're important, but it's gee, how do we pick and choose? But we really are working in a realm right now with a lot of these projects where there's no path of, there is not a path of, what am I saying? Or there's
Path of least resistance.
path of least resistance or path of no regret with each project, to where even if we're shifting things around, we're still getting a lot of value for it.
Sure. When I started with the organization back in 2005, none of the work that occurred in the Marker gravity. It kind of functions like a buried irrigation ditch. But I say, it did have a failure at one point, and the risk of failure was higher before we started all of this work, but with as much as we've accomplished now, it's way lower. This used to be one of the things in our system that I was concerned the most about, and it's less and less so every year.
Now shifting modes to the wastewater system. So I've got a couple of projects here on the wastewater system, and this is a pipeline project, which is the Lower Goose Creek project there in red, which actually that project ends just right outside here at the MSC. And where we're sitting now, and runs up Old Pearl as you get almost to the Foothills Parkway. And this was actually a project that we did the first phase in 2021, but we had some funding limitations. So we paused on that project because we went after other projects that had a higher priority. One of them was the main sewer interceptor project, which has just come online this year. And we also had the baseline road sewer interceptor. So we're pivoting back to this project. So that's an example of how we might shift some projects around. We would have loved to have done it back in 2021 if we had the funding, but we didn't. So it was a trade-off we had to make. So we're going to come back on this one. And this is a combination of increasing the diameter, which then allows us to increase the capacity of that line, as well as we're seeing some decreased demands in the city. And then pivoting to the work for the water resources recovery facility, showing two projects here on the screen in red. It's replacing the building's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems are old and need to be replaced. And it also includes a looped pipeline around the facilities, which we use for a hot water loop to heat the systems. This is actually an example of a project where we saw some significant cost escalation from when we were originally doing the cost estimating several years ago. We were thinking it was going to be about a $6 million project, but it's coming in at 11. And so that's that significant cost increase. So there is some additional funding that we're asking for in 2026, but it's also a project that we have delayed for several years because we went after other projects, particularly on the regulatory end on the phosphorus upgrade projects, which is just about to come online this year. And then the other projects that we're looking here in the CIP, we're doing some construction in 2026 on the primary clarifiers, which are the two circles in yellow. And those were the touch-based projects that I wanted. And again, we've got this list of projects in that $500,000 or greater range that we're asking RAB to take a look at for 2026. And I'll pause and stop for if there are questions on any of that.
So you mentioned that a few years ago you had to pause the sewer replacement, and so there's this like constant trade-off like challenge you face.
Correct.
Maybe could you tell us which of these projects and also water utility would be those ones that you might consider
Well,
trade-offs.
Well, pause and shuffle, and for instance, another one of those ones where we were trying to take advantage of things is not necessarily that, I'll say, talking with Chris Olson, who's here, who's my lead on, in the room, who's my lead on the wastewater program, and then Paul Sigmund, the lead operator at Perf. They don't want to pause on anything. But so if you want me to tell you what my priority project is, I will say I will fight to try to keep it, but we have a very good and realistic dialogue. When those numbers come in, for instance, in this HVAC project, there was another project that we were looking at to move forward. It was related to the public service power shutdown that happened last year, and we had put some funds, because there was some questions. Do we need backup power at the work? And so we had money assigned in 2025 for that project. Well, we knew it was an important enough job that we had to allocate funds. Well, then there was either almost or have completed agreements with Excel and the Public Utilities Commission to where Excel is going to be doing some different things to give us more reliable power in the shutdown. So we were able to take those funds and earmark and move them over towards the HVAC project. So that's again, that push-pull on trust me, the list is actually longer than this. And we would like to keep doing on that end, but I'm really proud of really everybody on the team when it does come to this, from finance or utilities leadership or even the engineering and the operations team. There's a great dialogue on that end, and we're all trying to be realistic.
You said HVAC has been delayed since 2021 already.
What,
That, I think we originally had funds in 2023. Memory serves. I'm Chris Olson. I manage the wastewater engineering. Yeah, I think we originally had some money allocated in 2023 to replace a failing segment of the hot water loop. And it's probably been on the plant staff's mind for a long time before that. So.
Maybe it's a naive question, but I just wonder how you make the trade-off. So you have all these different things. Obviously, everything's important. You have a system. If anything fails, kind of essentially everything fails. But is it an informal process? Is there a formula? Because I'm wondering, even if there's a way, I watch this as an analyst, you think about it as a way you could even program, all my considerations of, something to kind of tell me what, cost and risk and everything else.
It's a great question. From my vantage point, if you look at the funding of the different departments across the city, utilities budget is the highest by far. If you see it on a bar chart compared to the other 20 departments. And so I feel like in my role, we owe the public a certain level of sophistication in the way that we're going about assessing this. And I'm proud of the way the team does it. The condition index work and just assessing like asset management, the condition, what's the highest risk, what's the highest consequence of failure, staff availability, like it really is. If you think of a recording studio and a mixing board, that's the best analogy I can always think of, and we're constantly changing that balance and reevaluating, and it's a bit of a dynamic situation. As Chris was describing how we adapt to changing circumstances, it really depends. If a cost comes back on a project 25% more, but we're ready to do it, and we've got to find those funds, that we look at the other projects that are candidates, how ready are they? Which one could we maybe move out a year? And so there's also an element of judgment that just comes into it. And I think we do that in a very reasoned way in how we go about it. Both art and science.
And the last utility we're going to touch base on is several projects in the storm and flood utility. So this first one, is the South Boulder Creek phase flood mitigation project. And from a flood perspective, it's a pretty straightforward project. It consists of an earthen dam, which is kind of that dark red area, a concrete spillway or flood wall that really runs along US 36, and then an outlet works in that bright yellow that goes under 36 and connects back to South Boulder Creek. And that project has been going on for a long time. Projected cost is about $66 million. We're actually working on the bid documents and permitting, and we're looking actually to go out to bid on that project in the next few weeks. And the next one is the Gregory Canyon project and Gregory Canyon Creek project. And Joel, this is that where we talked about what storm level are we designing for. This is running from the confluence of Boulder Creek basically up through the hill area to Pennsylvania Avenue, and it's in the middle of backyards. And so as very steep, highly developed drainage way, we're designing for a 25-year storm.
25.
And
And
it's
historic 25.
that historic 25-year storm, whereas right now we've got somewhere in the range of about a 5-year storm capability.
Okay.
So we're talking about significant improvement, even with the limited space on the project that we have.
I think what you're getting to, Joel, is a valid question, like historic, looking back and using the historic occurrences on floods and using that as the basis of design. We now know that will tend to underestimate what a true 100-year flood is. And so in our comprehensive storm and flood plan, that gets to climate change.
Sure.
And we have some language in there. And we're trying to retrofit an old city to modern floodplain regulations. So this Gregory Creek one where you have houses on both sides, there's only so much room. And to try and buy all those houses, like it would just put it out of reach. So there's a practical balance in this utility of what's practical and feasible. And I think the team did a really, really good job of capturing that in the comprehensive plan, striving for the highest that we can get, building in climate change considerations when we can. There are elements of that in the South Boulder Creek project because we've got room to do it there. But
Even there, they were going to go up to 500 years.
Yeah.
No, I mean, and the point is you're increasing the capacity.
Yep.
So at least you'll be able to handle bigger events. And I assume too that there are then contingencies of what happens with it. The flood is, you get you get the 50-year event or 100-year event. So you get whatever you have to do with warning or.
well, then it becomes emergency response or hopefully proactively emergency preparation, and people do know the situation, and everyone still has to be ready regardless of what level we're designing to.
This is probably 1 in 25. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, thank you.
And then the last project in the storm and flood utility that I'd like to touch on is the Upper Goose Creek. And this is actually a combination of a flood project and a stormwater project. So stormwater, we're thinking that smaller, either 2 or 5 year storm, depending on if we're in residential or commercial. So that's where the photo shows. That's actually North Boulder Park at about 9th Street. And so that's a storm in 2023. And so we have a lot of backup and localized flooding in that storm event. So this project is to help with storm sewer in that smaller size in the upper part of the basin. But when you generate flows in the basin, we're trying not to harm anybody downstream. So we have to have somewhere for that water to go. So the flood component is on the left, is in the lower part of this drainage basin. We need to increase capacity down there to be able to handle that additional storm flood flow. So this project is actually, we've brought the consulting engineer and we're starting the design. And then we're looking at starting construction in 2028.
I mean, is that, the flooding there in that park, how much damage does that cause? It's inconvenience to people at the park, so they'll.
Well, I think it's not just the park. There's another photo that we have that we sometimes use in these presentations. And it's not that big of a thunderstorm that can create flooding on Broadway.
Yeah,
And cars are up to their wheel wells or up to their hoods in water. That's happened multiple times in the last, I don't know, 5-6 years. And just the capacity of the combined piped stormwater system and the flood drainages are not there. And it really needs attention.
Now, I will close things out before we hand it over to Steph to talk about financial matters. With again, that $500,000 in 2026 projects funding. And you'll see in here, things like, and you saw on some of the other sides where it says a program, that's something where we're infusing it with money. What do we actually, and it's more along the lines of, okay, we know we need to keep doing something year after year. Whereas Gregory Canyon Creek is for that one project.
Flood acquisition program is an example of, we fund it every year, we buy a property every once in a while.
Yeah. And the intent is having enough funds to buy a property. We'd like to say every year, but property values are going up in older too, so that money does not stretch as far in fiscal either. So any other questions about storm flood utility?
Oh. No, that's okay.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, Steph, I forgot about this slide. This is just a list of projects on where we talked about that transportation fund. This is interdepartmental projects that we're in utilities engineering may not be the lead on, but we're either helping with funding because it has a utilities component to a project, or we may be even advisors to other teams. And for instance, just one project I'll hit on is Primos Park, where that's a much needed park in North Boulder. But it has a stream running through that park, so there's a flood component. So we're in that with Parks and Recs is taking the lead, but then we're helping advisory on the flood component and then also contributing funding to that project as well for that flood portion of the project.
Some of those other city projects that are huge priorities in their own right might pull one of our projects forward in the priorities because it needs to be done.
And that would be in that storm flood. Primos Park is one of those reaches that needs a storm flood project, but we might not want to do it for 10 years, say. But because of the other need on the other departments, we're accelerating that project. And now I'll hand it over to Steph.
Thanks, Chris. Steph Klingman, Utilities Budget Analyst. Thanks for joining us tonight. So today I'll be covering some key financial topics related to our three utilities. And the goal is to help provide a clear picture for how we manage our financial resources, plan for future needs, and ensure the long-term financial health of the entire department. So I think a couple of these slides are a little refreshed from last time, but just wanted to go through our core utility funding sources. So our main sources of funding are primarily through user fees and municipal bonds, and occasionally supplemented by state and federal assistance programs. User fees provide our most stable source of revenue, and municipal bonding allows us to finance large projects up front that we then repay over time. Grants and low interest loans from our state and federal programs can reduce project cost. However, these funds are competitive and they often require projects to meet specific criteria. There's also a limitation of how much money we can receive in grant funding as an enterprise fund. So I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So user fees are the main source of funding for our department, but some of these secondary revenues help us also stay fiscally sound. The first one I have listed here are the plant investment fees. We also refer to those as PEVs. And these are the one-time fees from development used to fund system expansion. We also sell biogas and hydropower, which helps diversify income and support some of our sustainability goals. We also have other revenue sources that might include water lease sales, some supplemental service charges like meter install fees or late payments. We also receive interest earned, and you'll see that interest earned money tick up, usually right after we sell a bond, and then that will slowly decrease over time. All of these supplemental fees and revenues help round out the budget beyond our normal user fees. And in order to remain an enterprise under Tabor, no more than 10% of our revenue can come from government sources like grants. And we meet this requirement with the vast majority of our revenue being generated from our user fees. So these are the proposed rate increases for 2026. We are recommending or proposing an 8% increase in the water rate, a 6% increase in our wastewater rates, and a 5% increase in our stormwater and flood rates. This aligns with what we presented last year. For 2027 and 2028, we are proposing 8% increases in our water and wastewater funds and a 7% increase in our stormwater and flood funds. I'll just mention quickly, if you look back from last year, we did recommend a 6% increase for 2027. But due to some, growing capital needs, we are proposing an 8% increase for 2027 in the wastewater.
Recall what they've been last 5 years roughly on there.
Yeah, so last year, and there's actually a slide that covers the rate increases, but I can quickly just mention, last year we had an identical rate recommendation for 25 that's shown for 2026. We typically had about 5% rate increases for the wastewater fund. For water, it ranges between 6 and 8. And then for the stormwater and flood fund, there was a period of time from 21 to 24 that we had about 12% rate increases in anticipation of the stormwater bond for the salt project. Are there any other questions here?
Really quickly, could you remind us, are these rate increases just capital spending increases, or are these also controlling for inflation and other?
Both, yes, okay, good question. Yeah, and I think I looked at what the CPI, just like general water and sewer CPI increase was, just for the entire nation, it was about 5% from May 2024 and May 2025. So.
I just heard about if tariffs are imposed, I mean, there's a lot of equipment, could that have a noticeable effect on this, that might go up a percent or more?
Yeah, these are still unknowns.
Yeah.
So the next 3 or 4 slides, just wanted to show some bill impacts. The first one that we have here is the average single family residential bill. We're assuming an average consumption use of around 7,500 gallons. But you can see that with the 8% recommendation, we're going from $137.84 to $147.02. That's about a $9.18 increase. I think that's a little less than 7% for utilities. This is an old. I can show.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that. Did I grab the wrong slide?
Maybe so, that's okay.
Shall I stop sharing? My apologies on that.
I will say while they're switching things, that last slide that Steph showed, with the $9 increase, a trap that we can all fall into is to just say, well, it's only $7 a month. That doesn't seem that bad. So when you start accumulating that year after year after year, the people's bills get higher and higher, and we're trying to be mindful of that. But also, one thing I say to our team members, and we're having these conversations internally, is like, we do need to be mindful about affordability.
Right.
But at the same time, the infrastructure doesn't care. It's either going to keep working or it isn't.
Yep.
And
are there programs to help low income people?
We do definitely have bill assistance. I will say that is something that RAB has really supported us and has emphasized as an item that we need to focus on and make available to our community, because the majority of people in Boulder probably can pay and can afford it, but we need to make sure that we don't leave those who can't behind. And so really working on that program, it's in our work plan to keep building on that for the next few years. So.
Can I ask a question?
Mhm.
Does the city like forecast how much in the rates they're anticipating not collecting from those equity programs? Is that factored into like the budgets and things like that? Does that make sense?
In a way it is, I mean, by our charter, we can't, the utility itself, we can't give away free water or free services, or we jeopardize our enterprise status. And so in various ways, we track what we're collecting, we track the aging bills that haven't been paid. And then through our utility billing team and our customer service, when someone's struggling to pay their bill or falling behind, we can offer them a payment plan or see what the situation might be to keep them in service, but also capture those payments over time. So I don't know if that answered your question. We're not directly tracking it the way you asked, but through the various systems we have, we kind of get all that information one way or another.
But that like difference in revenue between like, including those support programs versus not is like factored into the rate projections over time.
Yes. I think later in the presentation here, Steph will show, she'll walk through one of the fund financials for one of the utilities, and it's really just all the revenue and all the expenses by line item, and you can see how we track that. We may or may not have that. We're getting there. No, it's good.
How pretty well have it.
It's
You know, I saw it loading.
yeah, my computer didn't sync, so I sorry about that. Let's try.
Part of my role here is to fill, this happens and to fill in the gaps when it did, so it's great that you're asking those questions.
Yes, so thank you, Joe.
So you're gonna talk about the bonds?
I have a slide that just shows the historical rate increases, and then sort of the bonds that are superimposed on there. But do you have a specific question on the bonds?
I was just curious about the South Boulder Creek.
Yeah, do you wanna?
Yeah, I can speak to that. We've been building up the from year to year, the funds for that and getting ready to bond. As you know, there's pretty publicly been a legal challenge to our bond situation. Can't really get into the details of that. The judge did just do a ruling on it within the last few weeks here and ruled in the city's favor. But it's a really good example. We're planning to pay for that project with bonds and finance it over time. And that allows us to keep reasonable, smooth rate increases. As we were thinking about, well, is there another way we could pay for that? What if we just did it with rate increases? And I asked Steph, what would that look like? And it would require like 2 years of roughly 70 or 80% rate increases, which has actually been done. We had when Steph gets to that historical rate increase slide after the 2013 flood, council did pass a 75% rate increase in the stormwater and flood fund. Anytime you do a rate increase, though, the base cost of services goes up and stays at that new level. The benefit of a bond is you can meter that out over time. if we did that type of a major rate increase for any project, and in the circumstances of South Boulder Creek, we would want that to come back down after we generated the funds, but bonding is such an important component of what we do in utility. And not just for the city of Boulder, but for every utility across the country. And it would be extremely concerning to not be able to do that.
Right.
We're on track.
Thank
you. Thank you for working through our difficulties.
Thank you. Went through the single family residential rate increase about $9.18 per month. Looking at a duplex, that is just slightly higher. It's about $12.35 across all three funds. And then wanted to look at a couple of commercial properties as well. So this just summarizes the impact for a large apartment complex with a 4-inch water meter. That's a pretty significant monthly increase, but it also trends in terms of the percent increase of about 6.7%.
How many apartments?
I was thinking that question might get asked. I don't know the unit number, but I can get back to you. It's quite large. It's about 6 million gallons of consumption a year, so it's a
It's
lot of
spread
units.
across many. Yeah.
Correct, yeah. And then the last one here is a restaurant with a 1.5-inch meter. That monthly increase is about $461.50. So this is the those historical rate increase slides. This is just the water initially, and you can see that, you know, in the last I think 10 years or so, we bonded about 4 times in the water fund. Those bonds tend to be between $30 and $35 million, and those rates, as I mentioned earlier, tended to be between 6 and 8% annual rate increases per year. The next bond payoff is scheduled for 2036. And then in the wastewater fund, we've bonded a little bit more frequently, and they have tended to be smaller amounts with the exception of our bond last year, which was around $61 million. And a large portion of that bond helped to pay for the MSC project. But here we've tended to have rate increases of about 5%, which is just kind of keeping up with inflation. So, you know, starting next year, we are proposing some higher rate increases for this fund. Our next bond matures in 2026 for the wastewater fund. And then finally, we've got the stormwater and flood fund.
As
Yeah.
promised.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
Yep, so 75% increase in 2015. Oh, sorry, Steve.
No, I was just exclaiming at the dramatic nature of the curve.
That was maybe the lining of pipes.
Actually, the pipelining is in the wastewater fund.
That was in the wastewater
Is,
fund.
if you can see that spike there in 2015 is that 30% increase. That's where we talked about that lining fund, whereas the 75% increase was really after post 2013 floods.
Various needs.
All of those probably.
Yeah, and I also mentioned this, but we had those really high rate increases between 21 and 2024 to help strengthen our financial position ahead of this South Boulder Creek bonding. And so going forward, we anticipate some more moderate rate increases somewhere in the 5 to 7% range. I just wanted to speak to our reserves and how they provide a strong financial foundation to support the utility through some unexpected challenges should we face any. We have our operating reserves, which support day-to-day expenses. And our operating reserves are currently set at 25% of operating expense. 25% of operating expenses. The water resiliency reserve is a fairly new reserve, I think, implemented in the last 5 years or so, and it's currently set at 10% of customer revenue that's generated in the water fund. We tend to contribute to it in higher revenue years or when we have a surplus. If it's a drier year, for example, we might experience a surplus of revenues. And the intent is to avoid sudden rate increases when conditions change. And then finally, our capital reserves provide funding for any sort of emergency response. I will just note, and if you've reviewed the attachments to the memo, we are gradually increasing the capital reserve funds for our wastewater and stormwater programs over time. So this is an example of the fund financial, again, that's provided in attachments. This is actually Schedule 3, and I know it's kind of small on the screen, but if you want to refer to attachment A, Schedule 3, feel free to. So just walking through a basic fund financial, it's a pretty simple math equation, but you start with your beginning fund balance, which is essentially the ending fund balance from the prior year. You add in your annual revenues and subtract your annual expenses, and this gives you a fund balance before reserves. We'll then subtract reserves, the reserves that I just spoke to. We subtract the allocation of reserves, which were set aside to manage financial risk, and the result is the ending fund balance, which we aim to keep positive. In our wastewater fund, the ending balance is expected to decline from about $51 million at the end of 24 to about $550,000. It's primarily due to the planned completion of several major capital projects. This decline is expected and not a concern since we're still able to meet our capital needs and reserve targets. And then we will slowly build that up over time in anticipation of future bonding. Last thing on the fund financial is that it brings together all of our financial assumptions to show a full picture of the utility's projected financial health. It also highlights our ongoing reinvestment in essential infrastructure, which is something that Chris pointed out when we were discussing the condition index earlier in the water fund. So all those things are key to maintaining, our strong service levels. And then I just have a couple of slides. I thought it might be helpful to walk through a few key financial metrics that are typically used to evaluate a utility's health. So this first one, which is probably familiar, is our days cash on hand, which shows how many days a utility can cover its operating expenses using its available cash reserves. The target does vary by utility, but the typical range is between 90 and 150 days. And you can see from this chart that we're generally staying within those target ranges, although some funds do fluctuate because of our planned capital spending. And then last slide here is the debt service coverage ratio, or the DSCR, you might be referred to as, and it's a way to measure how well the utility can pay back debt. A higher DSCR just means that the utility is in a stronger financial position to pay back its debt. And we tend to target a 2.0 times, which is indicative of a strong rating from S&P, but the city's minimum requirement is about 1.25 times. And again, you can say.
So what do the numbers mean? What are 1 or 2? What is that?
So it's just another way of describing how well we can cover our debt payments. So the calculation is also really simple. It's revenues, subtract out your operating expenses, and then you divide that by the total debt payments. So yeah, so using that equation, like in 2025, for example, looking at the wastewater fund, we can pay back our debt 2 times. And that's it for me. Are there any questions on finances?
One quick question, Stephanie. What's the time frame on issuing one of these bonds? How early do you have to start work on that and prior to actually receiving the funds? And is that all done in-house with you and your staff, or do you use outside bankers or consultants, or how does that process work sort of day to day?
That's a good question. So I'd say that it takes about 6 months under a normal process. And we do use outside legal counsel and outside financial consultants to help prepare us for any sort of bond sale. Our financial consultants really guide us through the process of meeting with a rating agency, and then when we do actually go to sell the bonds. And then our legal counsel helps prepare official statements. They help us prepare ordinances that we then present to council, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I will say from my perspective, since I've been in this role, I've really learned how big a body of work that is for our team. And Steph works with the central finance team as well. And there's a lot that goes into it. So it's something we have to build into our work plan to expect the staff time to support it.
We don't get much money from state and federal sources, right? It's small, that's probably.
We don't, we did receive a pretty significant grant, for the phosphorus project. It was about a $1.5 million, loan forgiveness or grant, which is pretty amazing. Yeah.
I do think one of the things we feel a sense of obligation to, though, is thinking about affordability for our community members. So we're constantly looking at the outside funding opportunities, and when it's also a big body of work to pursue those, and you can go after everything and spend a lot of time, so you have to be really targeted and thoughtful about it. But over the years, we usually have something in the mix most of the time that's getting outside funding.
Read that the state revolving fund or some of the EPA funds might be cut back. I don't know what's happening.
It's a really volatile time right now
Yeah,
to be,
yeah.
some of our other departments are rely more heavily on those things and are understandably nervous. I think going back to a question that came up with the board here tonight earlier, paraphrased, I think, like, how can the community have assurance that we're going about this in a methodical and logical and sophisticated way? One of the things that gives me that assurance is when we go through the bonding process and we have the outside bonding rating agencies look at our operations. It's essentially an independent audit. And we've had water and wastewater bonds in the last few years, and for the stormwater and flood bond associated with South Boulder and Creek, we were given a AAA rating, which is the highest that you can get. That's, I think, in the past in utilities in Boulder, we've had AA, and there are still good ratings that are lower than that, but yeah, but that's, for me, that's sort of a independent validation that I think the board and the community and staff can feel good about, that we get that.
Do you have any sense of how many public water utilities would fall in that same category, Joe? Is that pretty unusual for public utilities of our size, or is that sort of standard?
I don't know that it's standard, but Steph or Amy might have perspective on that.
I don't know off the top of my head, Steve. I do know that it does vary by utility. Amy, I don't know if you're gonna say something. I think I saw you motion towards this.
I am off mute. A lot of larger municipal utilities do have very strong ratings, credit ratings, and issue a lot of debt. They're recognized as having really reliable revenues and being low risk. Generally, the industry is seen as being low risk, and so it's not unusual for utilities to have high credit ratings, but Boulder does have a very high credit rating and that's definitely to your advantage. I would say that to Joel's point, the Biden Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act dedicated a lot of money to the water sector through the SRF, the state revolving fund programs, and there's basically one more year where that supplemental funding will be made available. And so, and the expectation is that the Trump administration is going to be through the bill that's being going through Congress right now, cutting EPA funding pretty significantly for water, unless things change dramatically. I mean, the EPA budget that came out a couple weeks ago has like 90% cuts to this SRF program and the WIFIA program. So if Boulder is interested in tapping into some more of that principal forgiveness and lower interest rates for the state SRF program, now is really the time to consider that, I'd say. Maybe you've already been having conversations with them, but that's my understanding.
We have been considering that for certain things. We're looking at it. So we have staff here to ask additional questions. It felt like the board was asking them as we went, and I actually appreciated the conversational nature of it. I like that when it happens. I think an earlier question, really early in the presentation of like, are we keeping up with the infrastructure? And the condition assessments, should we be doing more aggressive rates? I personally would say for this year, recommending what we're proposing here. I think you've probably seen the news in the paper about the financial pressures the city is experiencing across other funds, different than ours. But that tends to be experienced in our community members who are trying to pay their bills as well. So between some of the long-term forecasting that we have in mind in the utilities in that situation, I think just kind of staying where we're at. And maybe looking at getting more aggressive in the future would be how I'm feeling about it. But there,
Any other questions, for Stephanie?
Sorry, that was a little.
questions for Steph?
Yeah.
More from the board?
I just wonder how. We saw a chart a couple meetings ago of water use rates, they dropped somewhat. They're still dropping or? In terms, yeah, you know, water. use per-
Water
per-
efficiency,
per-
yeah, per capita. I think it has been leveling out since 2002. It's dropped significantly. I think one of the things on the upcoming agenda, we'll be talking to the board in July about water supply and water supply policy. I think as climate change goes forward and what I'm seeing from our team, we're gonna need, one of the levers we're gonna need is water conservation, probably more heavily in the future, so we're gonna need it to go down.
Do you have any other questions for Chris or for Stephanie? Okay. Well, thank you for the presentation, Chris, Stephanie, and all the people that helped to prepare that. I think that was a good summary. And if we don't have any other questions on that, let's move on. Does anybody on the board have any matters to raise this evening? If not, do we have any matters from staff, Joe?
Yeah, I have one, and before we completely depart from the CIP, really appreciate the board's input and questions tonight. I really like the conversation and how I'm feeling at this point. Unless you will individually reach out to us with concerns between now and July, feeling like putting this together and coming back with what we're proposing is where we're at as a staff team. And sensing a level of comfort from the board. I think that's what we would do, barring any other feedback. And with
And I mean,
that,
I guess your comment there at the end, Joe, about feeling like we might have to start to increase those rates a little bit more in the future is one that we should kind of keep on
yes,
the agenda going forward, and kind of check in with you guys at least once a year on that topic, and make sure that even though it might be politically difficult or unpopular, that to ensure that we're looking at rates that are going to get us to the point where we need to be. And I guess I'm a little bit concerned to hear you say that, because it makes us wonder if maybe these increases need to be higher at the moment.
it's a fair point, and I do think just naturally in the upcoming years, we'll be able to have that check-in with you and have a clearer picture of what we would want to recommend that way.
Okay,
Under matters, I just have one thing. I just wanted to mention to the board, I believe it's at its June 26th meeting, city council will be considering a water agreement with CU for their north campus. And it's really kind of development related, which is not in RAB's purview. But CU is one of the big users, and essentially what the agreement does is brings that part of their campus. They have a lot of housing there now, between, I believe, 17th Street and Folsom, just on the pretty much adjacent to the Boulder Creek path, they'll have housing there. And so this agreement will bring that part of their campus and their system in line with the way we have them set up on their accounts with other things. Matters relating to the university can generate interest, so community members may come to you as board members and have questions about that. I always try to mention those things. It's an administrative thing for us and development related, so if you had questions or concerns about that, we could certainly pass that on to council, but there's really no action required of the board.
okay. Anything else, Joe?
I don't have anything else under matters, and I think if I can open it quickly here, I can talk about the upcoming agenda. And just from memory, I believe in July, we'll have a public hearing and be asking the board for a recommendation to council on the CIP and rates. And then also having an information item on water supply planning and policy. I forget what the date of the July RAB meeting is, but we'll also be having a check-in with city council subsequent to the discussion we have with you.
21st.
21st.
And then in August, we don't have a meeting scheduled.
Right.
And just in the nick of time, I opened up the upcoming agenda, and then in September, we would have another action item on gray water policy. There's a state regulation that requires every municipality to act on that essentially. And then I believe we have an information item on another check-in on water-wise landscaping and code update. We had a member of our planning team here back in April, I believe, that briefed the board on that. So it'll be an update on that in advance of council action. So that's what we have on upcoming schedule.
Okay. Any other items that we need to discuss?
I think that takes care of it for staff tonight. Appreciate the conversations with the board.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Chris and Stephanie and everyone for the presentations tonight. I think it was a good, good, concise summary, and appreciate all the work that you guys always do for these meetings to condense all this stuff down into a, concise and understandable version for the board. So thank you again for that. And I think with that, we're ready for a motion to adjourn.
So.
In a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Hi,
Aye. Okay, thanks, everybody.
thanks.